What's up guys? In the background, you're going to see a level 89 Nightmare dungeon with monsters gain 30% life and deal physical damage as additional poison damage along with no beneficial modifier to myself. After my last shred video and seeing the potential of the build, I was pretty excited to optimize it and see how far we could go. I had tons of great suggestions in the comments on different things to test and how some of the mechanics worked. These changes were more focused on pushing higher Nightmare dungeons, so this is not the best possible version for a high damage speed farming build, but more of a balance of offense and defense. Make sure you're checking the notes section of the build for some of my tips for speed farming. Now on to the changes. The most important change was to our key passive. After tons of testing, I was ultimately very underwhelmed by Lupine Ferocity. Every build I've tried it on so far, it has just felt worse overall compared to the other options. This is especially the case in this build after trying out Ursine's Strength. Ursine's Strength is 30% more damage so long as we remain healthy, which is quite easy for the build. Not only is this a pretty sizable damage multiplier, it also plays into the double dipping with Stormclaw, making it incredibly good for the build. Some people suggested Bestial Rampage with the 25% attack speed, but it didn't feel nearly as impactful as the 30% damage from Ursine. The next big change I made was unfortunately dropping Waxing Gibbous. Now, one thing I want to make clear, Waxing Gibbous is definitely the superior weapon for any sort of speed farming or easy content, but once you start pushing into higher Nightmare dungeons, it starts to show its weaknesses. The obvious one being that you can't have nearly as high of uptime on the crit buff when things aren't constantly dying. The biggest thing though is the stats on the weapon are actually pretty underwhelming compared to just a normal legendary weapon. We're able to pick up things like vulnerable damage, willpower, and core skill damage. We also gain another aspect, which in this build was retaliation. This scales all the way up to 40% damage with our high fortify uptime. I made a couple other little tweaks here and there that I'll go over throughout the video, so make sure you're checking the build linked below for all the information. I also wanted to go over a couple of tips for playing the build that might help you when pushing into higher Nightmare dungeons. The single best thing you can do to increase your damage is to make sure you have vulnerable up. Most of the time, you won't have to think about it because the exploit glyph 3-second duration will last long enough for you to kill the monster. But if you ever find yourself fighting a single target that lives longer than that, make sure you reapply vulnerable with your Storm Strike. You can also use the enhancement node on Hurricane that has a chance to apply vulnerable. Another big thing is when you're using Blurred Beast. You won't get the damage from it if you are in melee range, you need to actually dash to get the damage. You'll see me moving back each time before using Shred on a single target, and you'll see a very faint green line connecting all the monsters that it hits. Normally, you don't have to worry about this, it's just something to think about for a single target. I also started using the active ability of Cyclone Armor much more for a couple of reasons. It can help stack up your rampaging aspect early in Grizzly Rage. It has a chance to proc Calm Before the Storm for a higher ultimate uptime, and pushing the mobs away makes it very easy to jump to them and get Blurred Beast procs. Speaking of rampaging procs, I don't see a lot of people mention this, but your Grizzly Rage ability actually does damage and pushes the monsters back slightly when you activate it. It can crit and will give you rampaging stacks, so make sure there are monsters nearby when you use it. When you're trying to push for a higher tier Nightmare dungeon, there's some things to keep in mind. The first being, a lot of people won't run just any sigil. They'll look for a very specific dungeon and for very specific affixes. A level 99 easy dungeon with good affixes could be much easier to run than say a bad level 95 sigil. Some other things to keep in mind is there's no timer in the dungeon and you can go as slow as you want. This means if your Grizzly Rage runs out, you can just run away and ignore the monsters until the cooldown is ready. You can also teleport out as many times as you want to refill your potions. I found the style of play of fishing for good sigils and kind of cheesing the dungeon pretty boring and uninteresting, so I didn't push my build as far as it probably could have gone. I made this build initially because I was looking for something to quickly farm with and was more than happy with how high it could push in Nightmare dungeons. It's very difficult on Druid to push high on a pure melee build without abusing Earthen Bulwark. I do still have some single target issues, but it's really only noticeable when fighting the final boss of a dungeon. If you're fighting an elite monster, you can usually do a big chunk of damage with the AoE overlap from Stormclaw, and if they're still alive, you can drag them into the next pack of monsters for more cleave damage. Against the end dungeon bosses though, they really don't pose much of a threat, so I'm not too worried about the lower sustained single target damage because I traded some of it off for higher defenses throughout the dungeon. You can also choose to run dungeons that just don't have bosses. Overall, I'm quite happy with where the build ended up, And I think if I wanted to, I could focus on perfecting my gear and looking for the perfect sigil, and I could see this build completing a level 100. I have a lot more builds and ideas I want to test and try out before season 1 though, so this will be my last shred update, barring any further changes. This is the second video I've made on this build, so if you're looking for a little bit more in-depth on the mechanics, you can go check out the first video, which I'll link below. So I won't spend too much time going over the skills and the gear, but I do want to go over them again in case this is the first time you've seen this build. So we have Storm Strike as our basic ability. This is because we have Tempest Roar. This applies damage reduction, which is very important for pushing high Nightmare dungeons. We have such high attack speed, you can easily weave Storm Strike in between shred uses to keep up the damage reduction. And most importantly, I talked about, this is where we're going to get our vulnerable for our single target. Moving down, we have Wild Impulses. We have higher cost of spirit on our shred, but it balances out with the damage and we're not too spirit starved when we're in Direwolf. We have Shred upgraded all the way down here to Primal Shred. This is most important for Blurred Beast because, as I said, Blurred Beast will only activate when you dash to the target. This makes it so that our second and third attack will also dash, so we can activate Blurred Beast on any of the dashes. Very important. Again, we still have a little bit of move speed here, crit here. Because we dropped Waxing Gibbous, we do want to focus on crit now. That's very important. Then we move over here to our defenses. We have Cyclone Armor. Cyclone Armor, I've seen a lot of people not really like too much. I gave some reasons about the activation being quite strong. The other thing is this node is actually very, very strong, I feel. Whenever you're diving into enemies, every 10 seconds, you'll have 30% additional damage reduction for 2 seconds. This is really good for something like Shred whenever you're jumping in and getting hit by melee. We have the normal Blood Howl setup. We have constant cooldown reduction through kills, attack speed, which is very important for the build, comboed with Vigilance for high damage reduction all the time. As we move down here, this is where we start to get a little iffy, as I've talked about before. Going pure werewolf, the skill tree isn't super well suited for it. Having Tempest Roar gives us better use of some of our skill points, but it's still kind of rough. We have Elemental Exposure here. This is okay, not too big. And then we have Endless Tempest here, so our Hurricane lasts a little bit longer. Hurricane is like the best thing in the build for lots of defensive reasons and utility, so you want to have this up as much as possible. Here's where I talked about if you are not having trouble defensively, you can grab this for a little bit better vulnerable uptime on things. Usually Exploit Glyph is going to have you covered for there. Otherwise though, you want some more damage reduction on Hurricane. Down here we have Envenom. This is the single best node on the Druid tree currently because this is multiplicative critical strike damage. You can see I have it all the way up to 6. Very good and very easy to keep poison up on our targets with Hurricane with Tempest Roar, and Shred being applied Toxic Claws gives us poison there. So pretty easy to keep poison up. Down here we have Grizzly Rage. This is the main point of the build. This is where we gain Unstoppable and all of our Fortify. Then we have some Fortify nodes over here. This increases the amount of Fortify we're getting from Grizzly Rage. Along with Nature's Resolve, when we're struck, we have a chance to get Fortify. And then finally, I have Unrestrained here. This is specifically for when you are not in Grizzly Rage, if you're not waiting for the cooldown. This will help keep you not crowd controlled as long. I did find though, as I went higher, if I didn't have Grizzly Rage up, I just played a lot more safe, and I didn't have to worry too much about getting crowd controlled. Down here in our key passive, this is where I switch to Ursine Strength. You will not gain the health benefit, but the while healthy, deal 30% increased damage is not reliant on Werebear form. You just have that all the time. So as I talked about before, Stormclaw will double dip on damage multipliers, meaning that this applies to the damage Shred does, which generates our Stormclaw damage, and then we reapply the damage modifiers again. So we get this twice on our Stormclaw damage proc. I did say that I tried Lupine Frosty, really was not happy with this. It's incredibly difficult to get this to actually proc on the sixth hit for the third hit of Shred. So wasn't really feeling it. Again, hopefully someone finds a way to really use this, but I've not had much success with it. Moving on to the gear, I've had a lot of people requesting me to kind of quickly go through my stats so you guys can see where I'm at overall. You can see we don't have much crit damage because this is a rampaging build, so we get our crit damage through the rampaging aspect. We went for a lot of kind of generic damage, as I talked about in the first video, for our double dip on Stormclaw. And then I can move down here for some of the defenses. We don't really pay attention to resistances too much. We look for damage reduction, which we can see here. Helmet slot, we have Tempest Roar. This is pretty much going to be in every Druid build looking to push high Nightmare dungeons, more or less, because it's that strong. The rolls on it don't really matter. You're pretty much just looking to get any Tempest Roar so you have your base Storm skills are now also Werewolf skills. On our chest piece, we have Vigorous, which is 15% damage reduction while shaped it into a werewolf. Technically speaking, the might aspect is probably better here, but that would require you to use Storm Strike every 6 seconds to keep up the damage reduction. So I just went with this because it was a little less I had to worry about. Life, Armor, double damage reduction rolls here. We're looking for an incredibly defensive chest. Again, if you're going for a speed farming build, you can put Mad Wolf's Glee here, will be perfect for that. On the gloves, this is where I have retaliation right now. It's not a big deal where you have it between your weapons, your rings, your offhand. I got a little bit better pair of gloves than last time, and I have +4 ranks to shred, which is the most important thing you're looking for. We have crit chance because again, we dropped waxing. We need that crit chance. I have attack speed, and then the last node you can kind of play around with. I've been sort of trying this out. Critical strike chance against injured enemies. We did run into issues with kind of single target, so I thought this might help kind of finish off enemies. I didn't get a very good roll on it, but the other three are what's most important. Down to the legs, we also have, similar to the chest, complete damage reduction, life, armor. I really like life on my druid builds because of things like masochistic being based on our life. And then our willpower node, I think a lot of people don't realize this, increases your healing received. So if you're getting health back based on your total health and you're having increased healing on that, it kind of synergizes quite well. We have lots of other ways to do max health healing, so I really like health on my gear, as you can see. Here I have my disobedience aspect, which is very good. I'm sure you guys know by now. Armor is incredibly strong and very overpowered. Down to the boots, we have Ghostwalker here. You can try to do something like Dark Howl instead with debilitating roar. I didn't quite like it as much as this. This feels really good because I want to step back and dash in with Blurred Beast. Willpower, damage reduction while injured, move speed, total armor, and werewolf. These boots are quite good. Down to the weapon, this is where we dropped Waxing Gibbous. This is not by any means perfect weapon, just the best weapon I had and is what I usually use. If you have the option, you want to use an axe in your main hand. This is just a mace because I had good rolls on it and it was a high eye level. And we have accelerating here, attack speed's quite good. Onto the necklace, most important things, ranks 2 in Venom and cooldown reduction. The other two you can go for defense or offense, whatever you get, but make sure you're getting high cooldown reduction and +3 ranks on Envenom. This is where I have a maxed out Stormclaw because Stormclaw is by far the majority of the damage in the build. It's incredibly strong, like I talked about again with the double dipping, and that's why we have it there. Down to the rings, this is where we have crit chance, vulnerable, maximum life. Those are the most important rolls. Then the last one I have lucky hit, it's okay. Critical strike damage is fine too, or just damage increase. I'm trying something with the lucky hit with like try to get more calm before the storm procs. It's kind of okay. Don't worry too much about it. But yeah, vulnerable damage, by far the most important, then critical strike chance, then life, then whatever you get after that. Both the rings, we have Direwolf here and Rampaging Werebeast here. The higher you get your Direwolf roll, the better spirit cost management you will have. Down here on our totem, not a great totem, but it has cooldown reduction and crit chance, which are the two most important things, and I was able to get 1 damage reduction roll. This is where, if I could get a perfect totem, I would see a huge increase on how well the build is doing. Ideally, you'd have 2 damage reduction rolls and maxed out. This is only 11% out of 20. Ideally, you'd have like 2 20% rolls, crit chance, and cooldown reduction. And this is where I have Blurred Beast. Maybe there's a way to put Blurred Beast on your necklace to do even more damage with the build, but I didn't want to test it too much because I really liked going for the Stormclaw side of it. For our gems and our armor, we went with damage reduction while fortified. I tried messing around with topazes for damage reduction while crowd controlled because we were most vulnerable outside of Grizzly Rage. I didn't really ever notice myself getting crowd controlled outside of Grizzly Rage once I started playing a little bit safer, so I went back to these. Down on our weapons, critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. I talked about you might be able to use amethysts here for dot damage, something to go with Blurred Beast. Again, that's pretty hard to test, so I just stuck with these because I knew they were working. In the jewelry, we have skulls for our armor because again, armor is quite good. For our elixirs, you can go with Fortitude for maximum life or Iron Skin for armor if you're going for a defensive route. For our offensive, now that we're not using Waxing Gibbous anymore, Cruelty gets a lot more value for the crit chance, but you can also go for Assault for the attack speed. In the Spirit Boons, pretty straightforward. We have Wariness and Deer for damage reduction to elites. We now have Scythe Talons for the 5% crit chance and Eagle because we don't have Waxing anymore. We want to crit so we can get Stormclaw procs, pretty important. Down here, we have Calamity to increase the duration of our Grizzly Rage. Masochistic is one of the most important Spirit Boons. You want to try to run this in every build that you can. Finally, this is where the kind of tricky part comes in. I do have Calm Before the Storm here. We do not have very great proc rates with this. We don't really go for Lucky Hit in the build, and even if we did, we don't really use nature magic skills too much. You can take this out and you can put it into Iron Feather for 10% more life. You can grab Swooping Attacks for attack speed. But again, even if this only procced, say, once or even twice during a Grizzly Rage cooldown, it's pretty good value, I'd say, compared to what else you could get. Finally, taking a look at the Paragon tree, I've not actually changed anything with the Paragon tree. I was quite happy with it. I'm sure there's things you could tweak to min-max it perfectly, but again, that's pretty hard to kind of figure out. So I'll quickly go over it. We go up here, we have the territorial glyph. We want to get as much damage reduction as we can in the Paragon tree. There's tons and tons of defenses here. A lot of people ask me, how do I get so tanky? The Paragon tree is where you're going to find a lot of it. The glyphs and the nodes. 10% damage reduction, increased damage to close targets. We talked about this before, but we went for as much generic damage as possible so that we could use it for the Stormclaw double dip. That's why we have damage to close here. Then we move on up to the Heightened Malice tree. This is an insane node. Our Tempest Roar plus Hurricane will poison enemies all around us, constantly giving us Heightened Malice so long as there's 3 nearby enemies, along with Shred being able to poison. That's a huge buff there. We have a lot of generic damage to poison enemies. Over here we have Fang and Claw. This is going to give us increased damage to close enemies, along with, you can see, increased damage to poison, damage reduction of poison enemies because of the 150% bonus to magic nodes within range. Now, you want to move over to Lust for Carnage next. This is where you're going to get a lot of your spirit sustained, so this is pretty important. You're going to get some generic attack speed, moving your way through here. We have Undaunted. Again, damage reduction, 97% damage while fortified, because we want to use it with Stormclaw and Shred. Once you move over to Lust for Carnage, you need to go back over here to the, you can see up here, Thunderstruck board. This allows us to get the additional bonus on the rare node here for more damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. Again, we're trying to get as tanky as possible. We have damage reduction while in werewolf form, and then damage while in werewolf form. So this is not with werewolf skills, which would not work with Stormclaw. This is while we're in werewolf form. So that's a very important distinction. You can see right here, I do have some Storm skill nodes, but again, this is just specifically for the willpower because we're trying to buff up the generic damage of our glyphs as much as possible. Then we sneak over into here for Bulwark. You can see I have enough willpower because I have willpower on my weapon to actually get that 4% bonus damage reduction while fortified, and this is why we need to path in this specific order on the boards. Then we can go back over here to the Constricting Tendrils board, where we get a little bit of life here, but more importantly, we have the Exploit glyph maxed out to as much possible dex on the board as we could, because vulnerable damage is absolutely insane, and you want to make sure you constantly have vulnerable up on the target. This will be your single best damage increase. Finally, we have Reclamation here for a little bit of Spirit on Kill to help with your spirit regen. Finally, Ancestral Guidance doesn't have the greatest uptime, but when it is up, it is a great damage multiplier and very good for the build. That's going to be it for me. I hope you guys are really enjoying the Shred build. Again, I think this build could do a 100 if someone was dedicated enough to farm out the perfect gear and find the right sigil and push for it. Again, there's so many other builds that I want to try out before season 1. There's so many other videos I want to make. I'm not giving up on the build by any means. I think this is actually a great build and better than a lot of people give it credit for. There's just so many things I want to do with so little time left before season 1. So if you guys try it out and you think you find some improvements and stuff, please leave them down in the comments below. Help each other out. I would love to know how Blurred Beast even works. That would be great. But otherwise, until next time, I'll see you guys later.